Hi, my name is Freya Bennett. I'm 24 years old and I live in New York City. I'm a university student studying marketing, but there's something about me that might surprise you. I've struggled with English even though I've been learning it for years. And it's not just about speaking English, it's about thinking in English. You might wonder, Freya, aren't you in the US? Don't you speak English every day? Yes, I do, but speaking English and thinking in English are two very different things. Let me tell you my story. I grew up in a bilingual household. My parents are originally from Brazil, so Portuguese was the first language I learned at home. We spoke mostly Portuguese, and even though I learned English in school, I always translated everything in my head before I spoke. If someone asked me, "How was your weekend?" my brain would first think in Portuguese, then I'd translate it into English and say, "My weekend was good." It might seem like a small thing, but this habit made my English slow. Conversations felt exhausting. I always needed a few extra seconds to respond, and sometimes, by the time I was ready to say something, the topic had already changed. Ed, I realized that this habit was holding me back. If I wanted to speak fluently, I had to stop thinking in Portuguese. I had to start thinking in English. The first realization, the first time I noticed this problem, was in my college classes. My professor would ask a question, and my classmates would answer quickly. I, on the other hand, would sit there, transla, in my head. I understood the question, but by the time I was ready to answer, someone else had already spoken. One day, my professor asked me a direct question in class. I panicked. I knew the answer, but my brain was busy translating. I could feel the eyes of my classmates on me. After a long pause, I finally answered. It wasn't terrible, but it wasn't natural either. After class, my friend Sophia noticed my frustration. "Freya, you know English. What's stopping you?" she asked. "I always think in Portuguese first," I admitted. She laughed. "That's your problem. You need to stop translating and start thinking in English." She was right. But how? Step 1. Surrounding myself with English. The first thing I did was change my environment. Even though I lived in the US, I realized I was still living in Portuguese. My phone was in Portuguese. My Netflix shows were mostly in Portuguese. Even my grocery lists were in Portuguese. So, I made a decision. I would switch everything to English. I changed my phone settings, started watching shows in English without subtitles, listened to English podcasts, and even set reminders in English on my phone. It felt strange at first, but my brain slowly started adjusting. Step 2. Speaking to myself in English. One day, I was walking home from class and decided to talk to myself in English. Not out loud. I didn't want people to think I was crazy. But in my head, I started narrating my day instead of thinking, pray. So Fazer Minha lets out a asa. I forced myself to think, I'm going to do my homework when I get home. At first, I had to concentrate, but after a few days, it became easier. My brain started processing things in English naturally. Step 3. Thinking in simple sentences. Another problem I faced was that my Portuguese thoughts were too complicated. I would try to translate them word for word, and it didn't always make sense in English. So I started using simple English in my thoughts. For example, instead of thinking asaro neo cho, amazed hard per prey, so marado, I would think, I hope it does rain later because I need to go to the store. Short, simple, direct. Step 4, describing what I see. One of the best exercises I did was describing things around me in English. When I was at a coffee shop, I would look around and think, the barista is making coffee. That man is reading a book. This coffee smells good. At first, it was slow, but over time, my brain started doing it automatically. Step 5, talking without worrying about mistakes. One of the biggest things that slowed me down was my fear of making mistakes. Every time I spoke, I worried about my grammar, but then I remembered something my English professor told me. Native speakers make mistakes too. She was right. I had heard my American friends say things like me and my friend went to the store, which isn't grammatically correct, but people still say it. I realized that fluency is more important than perfection, so I started speaking without overthinking. If I made a mistake, I kept going and something amazing happened. I became more confident. The turning point. A few months later, I had a big moment. I was in a group discussion in one of my classes. The professor asked a question, and before I even realized it, I answered without translating in my head. It was natural, it was automatic. The journey never stops. After that moment in class, I felt a new level of confidence. But the journey to thinking in English didn't stop there. I had to keep practicing, keep pushing myself, and keep challenging my mind. One of the biggest tests came when I had to give a presentation in front of my entire class. Public speaking is scary for most people, but for me, it was even harder. My brain was still adjusting, and I was afraid that under pressure, I might go back to translating in my head. So, I prepared differently this time. Instead of writing my speech in Portuguese and then translating it, I forced myself to write everything directly in English. I practiced out loud, recorded myself speaking, and listened back. On the day of the presentation, I was nervous, but something incredible happened. When I stood in front of the class, I started speaking without thinking about Portuguese at all. The words just came naturally. I wasn't just speaking English, I was thinking in English without fear, without hesitation. That moment made me realize that learning a language is not just about words and grammar. It's about changing the way you think, overcoming challenges. Of course, there were still challenges. Sometimes, when I was tired, my brain wanted to go back to Portuguese. And there were moments when I still felt stuck on certain words. But instead of getting frustrated, I reminded myself, this is normal. I started keeping a small notebook where I wrote down words or phrases that I struggled with. Every night before bed, I would review them little by little. Those words became part of my natural thoughts. Another challenge was speaking with native speakers who talked too fast. At first, I felt overwhelmed, but I developed a strategy. Instead of trying to understand every single word, I focused on the context. For example, if someone said, "Hey, want to grab a bite?" I didn't stop to think, what does grab a bite mean exactly? Instead, I understood from the situation that they were inviting me to eat. This mindset helped me stop overanalyzing and just go with the flow. The moment I knew I had changed, a few months after my journey started, something funny happened. I was walking through campus, texting my friend, when I suddenly realized I had written the whole message in English without even thinking about Portuguese. I stopped for a second. I wasn't translating, I wasn't hesitating. In my brain had fully switched to English. That was the moment I knew I had finally trained my mind to think in English. Thinking in English isn't about being perfect. Thinking in English isn't about being perfect. It's about making English a natural part of your life. If you're struggling right now, don't worry. It takes time, but it's possible. Just remember, stop translating in your head. Surround yourself with English every day. Talk to yourself in English. Use simple sentences and grow from there. Accept that mistakes are part of learning. If you keep practicing, one day you'll realize that your brain has made the switch just like mine did. The power of patience and persistence. After I realized my brain had started thinking in English, I felt proud, but I also knew that this was just the beginning. Learning a language is not something you do once and then stop. It's a continuous journey. Even after making so much progress, I still had moments when my mind would switch back to Portuguese, especially when I was tired or stressed. At first, I was frustrated. Why am I still thinking in Portuguese sometimes? But then I reminded myself, this is normal. Our brains are naturally wired to go back to the language we're most comfortable with. That's why I had to be consistent. My daily routine to keep thinking in English. Every day, I made sure to practice in small but effective ways. One, one morning routine in English. As soon as I woke up, I narrated my morning in English. I need to brush my teeth. I'll make some coffee. I have a class at 10 a.m. This set my brain in English mode for the day. Two, writing my thoughts before bed. I would write a short journal entry in English about my day. It didn't have to be perfect, but it helped me process my thoughts in English before sleeping. 3. Speaking English even when alone. Whenever I was alone, I practiced speaking out loud. If I was driving, I would talk about what I saw on the road. If I was cooking, I would say, "Now I'm cutting the onions. This smells amazing." Re- 4. English conversations. I told my friends and classmates that I wanted to practice more. So, even when I was with my Portuguese speaking friends, we challenged each other to speak only in English for at least 30 minutes. 5. Using English to solve problems. If I was thinking about something stressful like an assignment or an important decision, I forced myself to think through the problem in English. It helped me train my brain to handle even complex thoughts in English. These small steps made a huge difference. The first dream in English, one of the craziest moments in my journey, was the first time I dreamed in English. I remember waking up feeling shocked. My entire dream had been in English. I had spoken in English, and even the people in my dream were speaking in English. That's when I knew my brain had truly adapted. It didn't mean that I would never think in Portuguese again, but it showed me that my efforts were working, helping others who struggle with the same problem. After going through this journey, I started noticing that many people around me were struggling with the same thing, especially international students at my university. One day, I met a girl named Isabella who had recently moved from Argentina. She was fluent in English, but she told me she still thought in Spanish all the time. I smiled and said, I used to be exact like you. I shared my story with her, and she was shocked. But you sound so natural in English, she said, because I trained my brain. I told her, you can do it too. She started following my daily routine, and after a few months, she told me, Freya, I just realized I was thinking in English without even trying. That made me so happy because I knew how powerful the skill was. Think. Speaking in English isn't just about fluency, it's about confidence, connection, and growth. It's a journey that never truly ends, but every step is worth it. If you're on this path, remember you're not alone. Keep practicing, keep pushing, and one day you'll realize that your brain has made the switch. And when that happens, it'll feel like magic. If you enjoyed the video, don't forget to hit the like button and subscribe for more content like this. Your support means a lot and helps us keep creating.